that you want to be reunited with the people you lost. Our homecoming will be truly divine.
There's still a way out for us. But we don't have much time.
I think it's no secret that the remake of the first Dead Space was a huge success and is probably one of the best video game remakes since Resident Evil 2. They didn't just charge full price for repackaging the same game with new graphics. They took a game that was already highly praised for its setting, atmosphere, and gameplay and greatly improved upon it by making the levels interconnected, fleshing out the story and characters, and just countless quality of life improvements that made the gameplay even better. While I'm sure there are some aspects Dead Space fans might have preferred in the original, I think it's safe to say the consensus is that Motive took a near perfect game and made it even better. Not to mention, they basically gave the whole franchise a much deserved second chance. Speaking of second chances, just as I was typing the script for this video, EA sent out surveys to fans asking if they'd be interested in remakes for Dead Space 2 and 3.
Yes! Yes!
Me and my buddy personally enjoyed the first remake so much, we've decided to go back and replay 2 and 3. I haven't played Dead Space 2 since high school, but after just revisiting it and finishing my second playthrough, I'm only more excited for the potential remake now. I personally found I actually like Dead Space 2 more than 1. I just really enjoyed the setting, the story, the faster pacing, and this might be a hot topic, but I think the game is even a little scarier than 1.
I am shocked and appalled.
Heck, a lot of changes that were made to the original with the remake were inspired by Dead Space 2. The pulse rifle's alt-fire grenade launcher? Dead Space 2. Isaac talking? First done in Dead Space 2. The controls for zero-G sections? Dead Space 2. Isaac cussing out fools while he curve stomps them? That's right, Dead Space 2, baby! So since a Dead Space 2 remake is all but confirmed at this point, I wanted to make this video just to brainstorm some ideas that'll hopefully inspire Motive as they work on the next remake. However, I do want to drop a few disclaimers before we get started. First off, me suggesting all these things for Motive to change into doesn't mean I don't like the game. In fact, since replaying it, it's definitely bumped itself up in my list of favorite games. But like a wise man once said,
"It's good, but it can be better."
Also, these suggestions are just my opinions, so if you think I'm suggesting some bad ideas,
I'll stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
Finally, while the games have been out for a while, I think it's still worth noting that I'll be talking about some spoilers, so if you haven't played the Dead Space games and don't want aspects of the games ruined, maybe you should think twice before watching this. With all that said, let's get started. First up, this should be the most obvious one, but improving the graphics. Don't get me wrong, Dead Space 2 still looks pretty good for a game that came out in 2011. I mean, that Unitology church level was just a visual treat. However, the game does ultimately look mostly dated, and it's understandable since the game's already over 10 years old. And by the time they get to finishing the remake, it'll probably be about 15 years or older. There are so many aspects of the game that could be improved with a graphical facelift. Better textures, more detail on faces, better lighting and shadows to improve the horror aspect of the game, improved scenery, and more jaw-dropping backdrops when you look out of windows or around the station, and especially better gore effects. All the gore, necromorphs, and bodies help sell Dead Space's horrific atmosphere. While some parts still look pretty messed up even today, it has lost a lot of that horrific, grossed out feeling as the graphics started to age. Updating the graphics would really help emphasize just how horrific some of the body horror is, like the first transformation in the game, or even the dreaded eye scene. Though I'm not gonna lie, even knowing about the eye scene, it still made me uneasy even with its current graphics, and the idea of it looking even more realistic would just be sick in both an exciting and a disgusting way. The last aspect of the visuals I feel like Motive should update is with Nicole's design. She haunts Isaac throughout the game, and you can tell Visceral wanted her to be the scariest part. But honestly, she was probably the least scary part, and I kinda blame her design for that. I don't want them to scrap these scenes entirely, because I love them from a story perspective. But I can't lie, she looks goofy as fuck with her flashlight eyes. I've seen even the most scaredy cat people laugh at these parts, and it's kinda sad since they meant for these to be the scariest parts of the game. Even just changing her look slightly to maybe something like this would really go a long way. Now, we want them to do more than just update the visuals. Another obvious area they could improve with the remake is improving the horror elements of the game. Now, before I go any further, let me explain my earlier take on Dead Space 2 being scarier than 1, because the fandom's consensus usually is that Dead Space 1 is mostly focused on horror, Dead Space 2 puts more emphasis on action with moments of horror, and Dead Space 3 mostly abandoned horror altogether. Now, what we consider scary is subjective. If by scary we're talking about jumping out of our seat and screaming, then I personally wouldn't say either game is really that scary. Both made me very tense though, and I would say Dead Space 1 was better at making me feel tense with its slower pacing and claustrophobic hallways. But as far as actually getting spooked, besides for a few jump scares, the only thing that really made me jump in Dead Space 1 was those moments when a necromorph silently sneaks up behind me. However, despite Dead Space 2 having a faster pacing with more bombastic action set pieces and gameplay, there were also plenty of unnerving and disturbing moments that either made me feel uneasy or genuinely made me jump. If we had a scary scale between 1 and 10, Dead Space 1 would be a consistent 6 out of 10, while Dead Space 2 constantly jumps back and forth between a 3 and an 8 out of 10, but those 8 out of 10 moments blew anything from Dead Space 1 out of the water. It also does help that Dead Space 2 also had more jump scares that actually got me. Despite that, however, I do believe if Dead Space 2 does get a remake, Motive could help make those scary moments more consistent. I've already mentioned how even simply improving lighting and shadows could greatly improve the atmosphere for the game like it did for the first remake. You could also add new jump scares or terrifying moments for both newcomers and old fans who think they know what they're getting into. I can't remember where I saw this from, but I remember seeing something about how Dead Space 2 actually randomized certain jump scares, like the scene where a necromorph burst through a door, along with Motive bringing back the randomized enemy spawning from the first remake. It might be a cool idea to also have some more randomized jump scares. You open a door and a leaper could jump on you, or you're riding an elevator and a necromorph may or may not burst from the ceiling. This alone would keep players on their toes and make the game a lot more terrifying. There are other ideas I have for how we could make Dead Space 2 scarier, but I'll touch on those as I talk about certain other subjects later in the video. For the story aspects of the remake, I'd love to see them do what they did with the first remake and really flush out the story and characters. Whether it's adding more text or audio logs, some additional cutscenes, additional side missions, or hidden video recordings, or even just more references to past or future events in the series. I love how in the first remake, they added more setup for Dead Space 2, like fleshing out unitology, Isaac and Nicole's relationship, and even adding a new ending pretty much foreshadowing Dead Space 2. And there's so much material they could reference, like Dead Space Mobile, Dead Space Aftermath, Dead Space Severed, Dead Space Ignition, or even just leave breadcrumbs that foreshadow plot details for Dead Space 3, like the Brethren Moons, or the planet Tal Volantis. You could also flush out so many characters in this game that we really didn't get to know that much, like Dana, Tideman, or even Ellie. Or even just flush out certain parts of the plot, like EarthGov having Isaac build the marker, or the creation of the Ubermorph. There are so many characters or moments in Dead Space 2 that have so much potential to be expanded on. Like the first remake, Motive also has the chance to fix a few moments in the campaign I felt were kinda weird. Obviously, this part is super subjective, and you might feel differently about some of these scenes than I do, but here are some parts I'd like to see tweaked or changed. One moment was when Strauss tried to stab Isaac in the eye, and for some reason, Isaac's helmet decided to disassemble at the worst possible time. I think it was because Strauss damaged it with his first strike, but if that's the case, then maybe emphasize that, because I've seen many people nitpick that scene. There was also that one awkward moment where Isaac and Ellie drive a drilling vehicle into the EarthGov section of the station, and you can tell Visceral might have been running low on their budget with this scene. I was expecting this epic scene of this giant machine breaching through the ground of the station, but instead it just cuts to black before transitioning to this random still background shot of a room with Isaac throwing himself into frame. I don't know, this looked like some goofy cheap trick I would do in one of my old live action videos, and I do think Motive can make this look a little better. Speaking of goofy moments they can make look a little better, there's that QuickTime event where after Dana betrays you, a gunship blasts her and her goons. It quickly and precisely takes them out, but then while you're hanging for your life and mashing A, it goes from precise shots to literal stormtrooper aim and misses you at nearly point blank range, and it has plenty of time to try and shoot Isaac. Finally, while I personally got the gist of what was going on, I've seen a lot of people comment on how confusing the final act can get, and I don't blame them. There are a lot of moments of people rambling about the steps, talking about convergence and make us whole, and the final boss is literally battling the marker from within your mind. I wouldn't mind if they elaborated on some of this stuff more at the end, only because a lot of this stuff is crucial to the story, and yet a lot of it is very cryptic and told through rambling. But overall, these few silly moments are ultimately just little nitpicks, but still potential areas where Motive could make a great story even better. But going back to the idea of expanding, I'd like to see them show off more of certain sections of the Sprawl Station. I heard that apparently Visceral wanted to do more with the Unitology Church, and that would be awesome since that was one of my favorite levels in the game. I'd also love to see more of the civilian markets and quarters, as well as just more people who've either died, are hiding, or are trying to survive. Maybe even some that interact with Isaac and can either help or hinder his progress. And I'm down for some more space sequences. The 0G space sequences were some of my favorite sections in the first Dead Space remake, and I was a little bummed that there weren't more of them in the sequel. I don't know if it would work as well in the sequel as it did in the first remake, but if Motive could pull it off, I'd also be interested to see them make the station interconnected the same way the USG Ishimura was in the first remake. Though maybe instead of a tram, Isaac has other ways of transportation like a subway, transport vehicle, vents, or even just launch himself into space to cross to other areas. This isn't something that I'd need for the remake, but if they could do it, I'd be interested. But as far as areas to expand, there's one I'd love to see expanded even more than the others, and that is the USG Ishimura. Revisiting the Ishimura after doing 4 playthroughs of the first remake was seriously one of the coolest parts of the game. A lot of the game consists of fast-paced action, large set pieces, and little time to breathe. And then you get to the Ishimura, the ship where it all started. I've done so many playthroughs on this ship that I had most of the enemy positions memorized, so going through the ship, I was expecting time and time again to run into necromorphs only to be met with nothing. No enemies, little to no jump scares, nothing but quiet hallways. I get to a quarantine room and think, okay, they're locking me in here, surely enemies are gonna start jumping in. But no. It finished sanitizing the room, and I moved on. They even did a fake-out recreation of the giant tentacle jump scare from the first game, but even that turned out to just be a hallucination. At this point, I was getting so impatient and paranoid, just wondering when something was gonna come out after me. It just gave off this cool feeling of dread and fear of the unknown. But just as I caught on to this and was starting to praise the game for this restraint, a brute jump scares you and you go back to the typical rhythm of killing necromorphs. I wish they doubled down and extended this section to where maybe the necromorphs don't attack you until you're done and on your way out. Maybe as you walk through these empty hallways, you could also hear whispers from some of the first game's characters who died besides Nicole, like Kendra, Hammond, Mercer, or others. The last couple story-specific ideas involve the beginning and the end. For the beginning, I would like to see the prologue and maybe certain video calls have the option to be skippable for New Game Plus. This is actually one issue I had with the first remake. To get all your stuff from your previous playthrough, you had to go through over an hour of non-skippable moments of talking, walking, and just facing the necromorphs with little to nothing. Dead Space 2 is a little better about this, but still has the same issue with Isaac spending a decent amount of time in that hospital level. I understand making us go through it on our first playthrough, but what if we're replaying it? It would also be nice for people who want to speedrun the game, since that was a big issue for Dead Space speedruns back in the day. As for the ending, I actually love Dead Space 2's fake out credits ending where Ellie saves Isaac last minute, but I would like to see not one, but 2 more endings added in. The first could be like the first remake where you hunt collectibles to unlock a slightly different ending that foreshadows Dead Space 3. But I think it would also be cool if they added another ending for beating the game on impossible difficulty. You go through the entire game trying not to die, you beat the final boss, Isaac sits down, the credits start rolling, and that's it. Ellie doesn't come in to save you, you don't have to do one last QuickTime event, Isaac just accepts his fate and dies. I think this would be great for multiple reasons. First, because it's both dark and kinda hilarious how you go through your whole impossible difficulty run without dying, only to realize your death was inevitable. But more than anything, this would be nice because if you wanted, this could be where Dead Space's story ends. Yeah, we'd have the other endings that lead to Dead Space 3, but like many aspects of 3, the story really started to go off the rails at 3, and that DLC cliffhanger would never be resolved. And while a Dead Space 2 remake is guaranteed, depending on how well it performs, a Dead Space 3 remake may or may not happen. 3 would be such a bigger challenge to remake due to all its issues, and since it's not looked at as fondly as 1 and 2, it might not sell as well, and like last time, Dead Space 4 might get cancelled again. I'd like to see everything work out this time, but the gaming industry has disappointed me so many times that I'd probably feel better knowing if Dead Space 3 Remake or Dead Space 4 don't happen, there's at least still an ending that concludes and wraps up the overall story. Alright, now let's talk more about gameplay. There are some aspects I'd love to see tweaked or improved upon. One thing was the hacking minigame.
Time to hack.
There it is. Spin that one. Spin that one. Good. Spin that one. Spin it.
The words that you and James say make no sense.
Gangle it up. Good. Spin the corner. Straight down and spin it. Yeah. Oh, you got it. You got it.
Yeah.
Yes.
This was kinda meant to show off Isaac Clarke's skills as an engineer, but they're honestly kinda brain dead easy and only really made the game longer. The only time it really impacted me was when they lock you in a room with an Ubermorph and you gotta hack the terminal before it regenerates. But that's really all you have to do to really fix it. Just add some kind of pressure to the player while they're hacking. For example, you could leave the hacking minigame the same, but if you run out of time or hit the wrong spot, it'll alert another group of necromorphs that will attack you. It makes things more tense, but the hacking game is still pretty easy, so this won't happen a lot as long as you're careful. The next thing that could be tweaked to be a little more tense and less brain dead easy is the QuickTime events. Now, I understand leaving them the same for when enemies grab you and you gotta shake them off. However, Dead Space 2 really doubled down on this with a lot of its massive set pieces, and it does kill a lot of the tension when you have to do these. When enemies grab you, they're still doing damage until you get them off, so it's fine for that because you're racing to get them off before your health drops. But for the rest of these quote-unquote near-death experiences, they're so easily avoidable as long as you know how to mash A repeatedly. It makes me look at certain scenes that are meant to be tense, and then I see that A symbol appear and go, oh, I'm good, it's just a QuickTime event. An easy fix for these QuickTime events could be, instead of mashing, just have certain buttons pop up, and if you don't hit them in time or hit the wrong one, you die.
I'm going to die.
Or just do what Resident Evil 4 Remake is doing and make them actual gameplay sections. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time Dead Space copied RE4. Another thing I want to talk about is the vents. This seemed like a cool concept, but I think ultimately it just became another gimmick for getting around loading screens for certain sections. There were a few moments though that did show its true potential. The very first one you crawl in has a necromorph inside, and while you don't get attacked by it, what if you could get attacked while crawling through vents? There's also one section in the game where you actually get to change which room the vent takes you, and I think they should have used this more. I could absolutely see us having to do this for puzzles, to help with interconnected levels, or even to get access to secret rooms.
Secret room!
In fact, like the first remake, maybe they should just get rid of the node doors and have hidden vents around the levels. They could either be out in the open or behind certain marked panels, and once you find one, it'll lead you to a secret room full of loot. You don't have to waste any more of your nodes and you'll feel like a genius for finding them. Speaking of nodes, another change I'd like to see carried over from the first remake is filling all those node slots from the bench's upgrade trees. Going from the remake to Dead Space 2, I can't express enough how frustrating it was having to spend multiple nodes just to reach a single upgrade. Not to mention, I always had to stop myself from spending my last node so I could save it for the node doors. Sometimes I would literally just need one more node and it'd be like, nope, you gotta save it for the node doors. Now, I can understand if some Dead Space 2 fans appreciate the node doors because of that whole choosing to save a node to get some rewards down the road, but it's hard for me to appreciate them when they're companioned with these filler blank spots. After my first playthrough, I only had Isaac's suit, stasis, and plasma cutter maxed out, and 2 other weapons mostly upgraded, but even after 2 playthroughs, there were still so many empty spots for so many weapons. Having to waste multiple nodes on a few weapon upgrades really killed my need to experiment with many weapons on my first playthrough. If it takes multiple nodes just to upgrade something like damage or capacity, then I'm not gonna waste it on a gun I might hate or not use much, like the rivet gun or the pulse rifle. I just love in the remake how every node rewarded you with an upgrade. It made every node feel valuable, whereas in Dead Space 2, I'd have a whole bunch of nodes thinking it was going to amount to much, only to realize I only had enough for 1 or 2 upgrades at best.
I got a $100 check from my grandma, and my dad said I need to put it in the bank so it can grow over the years.
Well, that's fantastic. A really smart decision, young man. We can put that check in a money market mutual fund. Then we'll reinvest the earnings into foreign currency accounts with compounding interest, and it's gone.
What?
And if Motive gets rid of node doors, then that's even more nodes I could put toward upgrades. Though, if people really enjoy the blank spots and node doors, then I guess they could potentially keep both features for harder difficulties to add extra challenge. Now let's transition to the shop next, because it has a unique issue. Now the shop itself is mostly fine. It is annoying how you can't sell or buy things in bulk like in the remake, and you gotta do it one at a time, but other than that, it's fine. However, when you arrive at the first shop, you'll notice something weird. Apparently for some reason, EA felt pushed to just give everyone all the DLC suits and weapons at the start of the game. As generous as this is, I don't think I have to go into much detail explaining why a survival horror game giving you every gun in the game at the start kinda kills the game's pacing. The weapon portion of these DLCs should honestly just be cut. As for the suits, I'd like to see them come back but in a reworked way. As is, the suits each offer different and random perks like store discounts or more damage percentage with certain weapons, and have a different amount of armor and inventory space. A way they could fix this is by having the basic in-game suits be earned normally throughout the campaign, with each rig having a speciality to certain conditions. For example, the security rig, being more of a police or riot uniform, could be more effective against projectiles, whereas the classic engineer rig could be better for something like quicker hacking. But while the base rigs would have different functionality, their various DLC skins would be cosmetic only and would be schematics you'd find around each level. You could also have things like armor and inventory added to the armor's upgrade tree. This one is a little more brainstormed, but Motive could definitely balance and rework it much better than just dumping all the DLC skins and weapons at the start of the game. Speaking of weapons, let's quickly go over the game's weapons. Dead Space 2 did do an overall great job adding fun new weapons like the Seeker Rifle and Javelin Gun, but I could see Motive nerfing or buffing certain weapons. Weapons like the Detonator, Rivet Gun, Force Gun, and Pulse Rifle did feel underwhelming, while the Contact Beam was so good, it was honestly broken. This gun has a Stasis Shock Blast ability that dominates crowds, and it literally ruined the final boss for me. Like, I beat the final boss so fast, it felt like I broke the game. Like in the first remake, it'd be cool if we had some cinematics for finding weapons. I mean, we basically had that with the plasma cutter. A couple other examples could be something like when those security guards tried to shoot you before being jumped and they could drop the pulse rifle, or you could pick up the Seeker rifle from a dead sniper, or you could find the detonator after you clear some trip mines. Just like with the first game, when you kill enemies, open lockers, or smash crates, you'll find ammo that'll usually be for the weapons you're carrying. However, this didn't seem as polished as it was in the remake. For starters, I noticed more so in this game than the remake, I would constantly get more ammo for one of my guns while I was scrapping the bottom of the barrel for my other equipped weapons. I would like to see them even out the drop rates better. There were moments in Dead Space 2 where I was getting ammo for guns I wasn't even carrying as well, and that can get kind of annoying. Finally, on the topic of enemies dropping loot, I noticed sometimes enemy bodies would despawn, and that can be bad if you haven't stomped on them yet and taken the loot they're holding. I usually noticed this when I was versing waves of necromorphs, especially the child ones. Also completely off topic, but is it just me or did Visceral have a weird obsession with killing babies and kids?
suddenly when the babies were cooing and giggling as they were chasing, and then when you started hacking at them with your scythe and they started crying like babies do, it became much more real and much more disturbing, and wow, I'm attacking babies.
Now, talking about enemies, I actually don't have much to say. Most of the enemies in Dead Space 2 are honestly perfect as is. Even the more annoying enemies like the regenerating Ubermorph or the puker that slows you with its acidic vomit help change the pacing and make combat more tense. But there are 3 enemies I do want to see some tweaks for. The first is for the Stalker, ironically one of my favorite enemies in the game. I love almost everything about this enemy, from its design, the sounds it makes, to even how they don't attack you directly and just hop from cover to cover, occasionally peeking their heads to try and distract you, and eventually charging you when your guard is down. However, there's one thing about them that honestly almost ruins the enemy for me. I picked up on a pattern they do, where unless you're right on top of them, they only ever charge you after they peek their head out of cover. I don't know if this is a glitch, if this is just for normal difficulty and they're smarter on harder difficulties, or if this is just how they act, but once I picked up on this pattern, they did become a lot more predictable. When there are many of them, it wasn't too bad as I was trying to keep my eye on each one, but when there's only like 1 or 2, it did trivialize things. I'd simply like to see them less predictable. Maybe have them not charge you until you're either too close or you aren't looking at them. They could attempt to circle you and hide. One of them can distract you by peeking their head out while another charges you while you're not looking. Alternatively, you could just have them charge you at random instead of always doing it after they peek their heads out. I just love how unique and clever the Stalkers are and would love to see them at their full potential. I want it to feel like that one scene from the first Jurassic Park where that dude is hunting the velociraptors and they get the drop on him.
Clever girl.
If the Stalker was my favorite enemy in the game, my least favorite is probably that enemy you fight in a lot of the 0G sections. Wait, what the fuck was it called? Oh, they're called the Nest. Well, the Nest enemies were just annoying. It's basically just spams heat-seeking fleshy missiles at you until you shoot 3 of its glowy bits and then just dies. These were the kind of enemies that weren't necessarily hard, but they were just annoying because they're spamming these super accurate fleshy missiles at you, constantly doing unnecessary damage, while you're just trying to either close the distance or line up your shots. Honestly, they're basically the 0G version of the wall enemies. If Motive could tweak these to be more fun, I'd appreciate that, but honestly, I would not care in the slightest if these guys were just cut. The last enemy I'd like to see tweaked is an ironic one because it shows up the least in the game and yet was shown off in a lot of the game's marketing. After you're betrayed by Dana and that gunship wipes out everyone but you run into this giant necromorph called the Tormentor, and I gotta say, I did love all the time I spent with it. You have this awesome first sequence of avoiding its attacks and taking pot shots at its arms. Then it chases you and you gotta use your kinesis to clear your path while it's chasing you. And then you get this intense cinematic of the gunship returning and shooting out the windows, which forces both Isaac and the Tormentor out into space. Isaac uses some explosive barrels to blow up the gunship with the Tormentor on it, and that's it. I guess the Tormentor's dead because we never see it again. Seriously?
Well, this sucks.
You give me 2 minutes of some of the most exciting parts of the game and just never use this thing again. Well, that gave me a bad case of blue balls. I would have loved to see the Tormentor used more in this game. Have it stalk or occasionally jump scare Isaac. Give it some more build up or foreshadowing. They could even do what they did with the Leviathan in the first game. You think you got rid of it, but then it turns out it's been crawling around outside of the station. But then later in the game, it jump scares Isaac while you're doing one of those 0G sections. There are so many areas that could be great spots for a potential 0G Tormentor boss fight, including one where you'd have the perfect arena and you would just have to swap out that annoying nest enemy. I don't know, I just feel like an enemy that was shown so much in the marketing should have been in the game longer than it was. But yeah, I think that's everything, though I feel like I'm missing a big part of the game. Hold on. Oh yeah, this game did have multiplayer.
We've got to take out as many of them as we can before they reach the public sector. We've got it. We've got it. Watch for ambushes. These things are hunting us. We've got it. Cover each other. We'll never make it. Stalker, run lock. Let's go. Hold the detonator primer on the fuel core. Move, move, move. 30 seconds. We're barely gonna make it. Move, move, move.
I wanted to finish off my ideas by discussing multiplayer because this is an aspect of Dead Space 2 Motive might not even adapt for the remake. The game honestly is worth it for the single player alone, and the multiplayer did have a bit of a mixed reaction. Some loved it and still play it to this day, while others felt it was kind of a gimmick mode. And to be fair, regardless of how you feel about it, you can't deny it was tacked on. Due to the success of games at the time like COD and Halo, almost every game was trying to force a multiplayer. And I mean almost every game. Dead Space 2 added multiplayer, BioShock 2 added multiplayer, the Assassin's Creed games had multiplayer for a bit, God of War Ascension tried multiplayer, heck, they even tried to make multiplayer for Batman. Twice. That said though, even some of these more forced multiplayers had their charm, and I do believe Dead Space 2 did try to do something unique with it. I played a little back in the day, but revisited it and played for a couple days just to see how it holds up. You do have to pick your times wisely, and will probably have to wait around 10 to 30 minutes, but if you're patient, you will find games. But was it worth waiting? Well, the best phrase I would use to describe the multiplayer is frustratingly enjoyable. I can definitely see the appeal with the multiplayer. Playing as the humans felt tense as you're not only racing to try and accomplish these objectives, but you also have to worry about player-controlled necromorphs that aren't as predictable as the AI ones. They'll ambush, hide near corners, and jump you when your guard is down. This really promoted my team to balance not staying put for too long, but also sticking together and not getting separated or picked off. Playing as a necromorphs was also cool, as you have a variety of types to choose from, and you can pick where you spawn from. They're a lot more vulnerable than the humans, but they don't have limited resources like they do, and your goal is simply to stall them until the clock runs out. I also love how these matches not only let both teams try both sides, but how they tie in with the main narrative, as you're basically on a different part of the station during the same time as the main plot. However, while there's a lot to enjoy, I can see why this multiplayer wasn't popular, because there's quite a few problems that hold it back for me. For one, leveling up doesn't just give you suits, but also in-game rewards and upgrades that gives higher level players an advantage over newer players, like more weapons, more stasis, more melee damage, more accuracy, etc. Also, as tired as I am of overly strict matchmaking in multiplayer games, this one was so loose it was kinda dumb. Like putting a level 3 and my level 7 ass against a level 40 and a level 60. And these unbalanced teams do lead to a lot of scenarios where the human team is either steamrolling past the necromorph team or is getting spawn camped by them. The mode would have benefited from a little spawn protection, some more alternate routes instead of a lot of single hallways, and maybe swap those game-breaking rewards with more cosmetic customization. I also feel like the variety wasn't the best. there aren't too many maps or loadouts, so it doesn't take long before you've seen everything the game has to offer. If they do bring the PvP back, maybe they could offer more maps and objectives. Maybe some maps where the necromorphs are trying to accomplish goals and the human team must stop them, or even turn it into a more cooperative mode like Darktide or GTFO. Those were the main issues with the game, but there were other issues we gotta address. The hit detection was all over the place, and sometimes I couldn't tell if it was because of the meta and what weapons I was using, if there was input delay, or if it was just because of cheaters, which is typical with multiplayer games. But there were so many moments where you feel like you're shooting directly at your opponent and they just don't die, but then they turn around and one-tap you. There's also so many moments where when you're playing as a human, you have limited healing and stasis, so you only get like 1 or 2 heals and stasis shots. But when I go up against humans, it seems like they have an endless supply. At this point, I didn't cry cheater because you can resupply from killing the AI necromorphs. But there were a couple points where even with that knowledge, it was still getting kinda sus. Wait, did that necromorph just vent? But then one time this guy's team was losing and he dropped being subtle and just started rapid firing the pulse rifle's grenade launcher shots. At that point, I knew this multiplayer had a cheater problem. If they bring back the multiplayer, it seriously needs some better anti-cheat precautions. Off the record, I don't know what's more sad, the fact that you have to cheat in a game with like 12 players left, or the fact that despite you cheating and being max rank, you still lost to us.
I'm gonna go f your mom.
There is also one other issue we might face if they do decide to bring Dead Space 2's multiplayer back. We are talking about EA here, and as you might have noticed, live service games and battle passes are kinda an overcrowded trend right now. If they brought back the multiplayer, I absolutely do not want to see its leveling rewards turned into some heavily monetized battle pass. It's been done to death, it's shown numerous times that it's just as likely to fail as it is to succeed, and it's just got such a bad rap about it that this remake would honestly be better off skipping the multiplayer and avoiding the bad publicity. In fact, this is the very last suggestion I want to leave in this video. EA, please do not push or rush motive as they work on this. It's great to see the series get a second chance and EA being open to more, but let's not forget why this series went dormant for so many years in the first place. EA had a bad rap of trying to force many of its games to be mega franchises at that time, and ditched many of them when they didn't profit enough, and they did do a lot of corporate meddling. Just let them take their time to polish everything and the money will flow naturally. And those are my ideas for how Motive could remake Dead Space 2. Now, despite all these aspects I've pointed out, I still can't stress enough that Dead Space 2, even as is still an amazing game. Some would even argue a near perfect game. But some also said the first game was a near perfect game, and yet Motive went in and made the game arguably even better. And that's honestly why I went out of my way to make this video, because if Motive can take that same effort and passion they put into the first remake and perfect Dead Space 2, then we just might end up with one of the best games of all time. But what do you guys think? What would you guys like to see in a Dead Space 2 remake? Do you like any of my suggestions? Or do you think they shouldn't even bother and just skip right to 4? I hope you enjoyed this video essay. I don't do these type of videos a lot because they require more effort, but I'd like to do more if you guys enjoy them. If you like other content like memes, tributes, machinimas, and more, then feel free to check out my channel and maybe even subscribe. I've done a couple other Dead Space related videos as well as videos on other stuff. Now if you excuse me, I'm gonna go continue my Dead Space marathon. And man, after finishing the remake in Dead Space 2, I'm sure it can't go downhill from here.